eyes are feeling red again. I'm bringing light like Thomas Funky Anderson. Been in the desert for 47 days, purple haze, the poison that it tastes to never change.
Bill Clinton set the current standard of sorts for politicians. An admission of youthful drug use doesn't necessarily exclude you from holding public office. That must be some relief to Kim Campbell and Jean Charest. When they both admitted to having tried pot in their university days, it caused hardly a ripple. Does that mean that everyone can relax, feel safe from prosecution about pot smoking these days? We asked the CBC's Neil MacDonald to find out. Here's his report.
Every sunny Sunday on the eastern slope of the hill Montreal likes to call a mountain, the crowds gather, beckoned only by word of mouth and by the hollow call of bongos. Nowhere else in Canada can this sort of thing be found. There is nostalgia here, if indeed people can be nostalgic for an era that took place before many of them were even born. Bongo Sunday is unorganized and joyful and rebellious. And all around, people smoke marijuana as openly as they did 25 years ago, when this kind of event would have been called a happening. And, like the happenings of long ago, Bongo Sunday seems to consider itself kind of a bust-free zone.
It's tolerated here.
You think so?
Usually, yeah. Well, not really, but the cops, you know, police don't come and say anything, you know, they'll pass around and arrest people who are smoking marijuana.
But that kind of thinking isn't confined to Montreal's Bongo Sunday. It's also something a lot of other Canadian pot smokers believe, that the laws against simple possession of cannabis are largely unenforced nowadays, much like the laws on office gambling or fortune-telling. The police in the 90s have better things to do than chase people around for a handful of joints or a few plants in the backyard. And those assumptions could not be more wrong.
Hi, Vancouver Police. We have a warrant to search your house for narcotics.
In point of fact, Canada's war on drugs is mostly a war on marijuana. The overwhelming majority of drug busts in Canada are pot busts, and most of the billions Canada spends on drug enforcement are spent to stop people from smoking marijuana, something 4 in 10 Canadians admit having done. Many thousands of Canadians are charged every year. People who didn't think they were criminals find out they are. Just ask Jeff Shurey, until last year a school teacher and middle-class stalwart in London, Ontario.
My wife and I've smoked marijuana for over 21 years, and she has for over 15. I found it to be a part of my life that I didn't want to give up, and I felt that in the privacy of my own home, I could grow my own marijuana.
Because of his position, Shurey didn't want to buy from drug dealers. Then one of his neighbors called Crime Stoppers. Shurey was busted, fired, and has a criminal record that prevents travel to the U.S. He now does odd jobs for a living. Just ask Adrian Plant, a machinist in Sarnia, Ontario, with a fondness for pot and a real stubborn streak.
I got caught with the one joint. I was 89. That got me a $100 fine. I pled guilty, you know, get it over with, be a part of your system. Mm-hmm. And then the second time, they kicked my doors in, and I wasn't home, threw all my stuff all over the place.
But they got seeds.
They got seeds, and that got me a $200 fine.
And then this time you went to jail.
Right, this time I went to jail.
7 days behind bars for possession of a few joints worth of marijuana. Or ask Dave Marquardt, a farmer who likes to smoke pot to relieve the boredom of the small town and life in the fields.
After 10, 12, 14 hours a day, sometimes longer than that, depending what we're doing. Sometimes when we're in white beans, we're going 24 hours a day. So it's a pick-me-up and a relaxer all at the same time. And it just, to me, it helps me get along better and do my job.
Marquardt had 6 plants, about 1.5 inches tall, in his closet. he now has one of those records that stop you at the border.
And it's a small guy that doesn't bother anybody, keeping to himself, minding his own business, that gets busted, gets the record, and is looked down on where our higher-up people aren't.
That's a none too subtle reference to two Canadians whose very names inspire seething resentment amongst convicted cannabis users. Both Kim Campbell and Jean Charest admit having used marijuana, and both favor to continue prosecuting people for doing what they themselves have done.
I think that the law and the penalties relating to the various levels of usage are appropriate.
You don't think they should be softened?
I don't sense any strong demand from things that they should be, and I was Justice Minister in that portfolio for a long time and never heard that demand.
Nobody's suggesting that we decriminalize. I don't think it's the answer. I don't think it's the solution.
Well, it isn't quite true that nobody is suggesting we decriminalize. It's just that the reformers, in political terms, are nobodies.
They considered alcohol harmless. And certainly we advertised it.
A loose network of groups such as the New Normal or the Hamilton-based Church of the Universe, whose members consider cannabis a sacrament and whose director faces cannabis charges.
If you and I were not afraid of an RCMP officer coming in and busting down poor Umberto's door and throwing us all on their floor.
Yeah. Oh, too heavy duty.
Then I could pass this joint to you and you could take it with a smile on your face.
Theatrical, perhaps, but the combined efforts of these folks aren't even enough to mildly annoy the people who run the country.
There was something called the
Who could blame them, then, if they daydream from time to time about the heady days of victory parties of 14 years ago? Decriminalization, if not legalization, seemed so close back then. The original NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, had thousands of members and a good dose of national sympathy.
What's your message then to the Prime Minister? We got the support. Have you?
NORML held huge outdoor rallies and fundraisers and made the establishment pay attention. Actually, for a while there, NORML seemed to be the establishment. Toronto lawyer Clay Ruby co-founded NORML Canada in the 70s, and he remembers the driving force.
I think it was police charging practices that arrested kids of the judges and the politicians and the lawyers and the senior executives in business. Those kids went down and mixed in an milieu, the hippie milieu, where no one could tell the rich from the poor, the powerful from the powerless, and therefore they got arrested. And the parents got very upset about that. That's no longer happening.
And, of course, the politicians paid attention. How could they not?
Les infractions relatives au cannabis.
Reform of the pot laws was set out in the 1980 speech from the throne. Soon, there was all-party agreement to decriminalize. The Liberals considered, amongst other things, reducing simple possession of pot to the equivalent of a speeding ticket. And then, suddenly, it all withered.
Drugs rip right through the moral fiber of our countries.
The 80s arrived. So did just say no to drugs. Decriminalization became inappropriate. NORML membership dried up. By 1984, Canada's marijuana lobby had vanished. Today, all that's left of NORML is packed into cardboard boxes at Canada's National Archives. A brief burst of liberalism documented in thousands of optimistic memoranda, strategy notes, reports from secret supporters inside government, and literature. Magazines like these, by the way, were legally banned in 1988. The NORML activists did manage to put several parliamentarians on the record about their favorite subject, and to a casual reader, some of these responses are surprising. Eric Nielsen, once Deputy Prime Minister, supported decriminalization of both possession and cultivation of marijuana. John Diefenbaker did not feel that first-time offenders should even be sentenced. Ernie Manning, Preston Manning's father, supported the removal of all criminal penalties for the private possession of marijuana. There are several letters in here from Pierre Trudeau stating his intent to decriminalize, but by far the most categorical language was used by Joe Clark, both as leader of the opposition and as Prime Minister. Simple possession of marijuana should be decriminalized, wrote Clark in 1979. If the Trudeau government believes the law is too harsh, as we do, then it should have the courage to change it. Clark went on to say that direct government sales of marijuana should be considered, and, ever the professional politician, he pondered the fat potential tax revenues. The effect on our economy of legalized sales of marijuana, he concluded, could be a healthy one. In government, Clark never got the chance to make good on that. Today, it's all just a memory.
I suppose that part of what happened is that the issue died. My letter was written in response to pressure that had been raised, questions that had been asked. We had, as you can imagine, quite a debate in our caucus, and I responded to it as leader of the opposition at the time. And we took a position that the law was not being respected and so was not effective.
It's a pity that the legislation was never passed specifically on cannabis.
Marc Lalonde was Pierre Trudeau's justice minister.
Some progress was made, but obviously today the possession of cannabis is still an offense under the Narcotics Act, so carrying penalties that obviously are, I think, even more today than 15 years ago, out of touch with reality. Let's hope that the judges are not applying them too often.
But they are. Just ask the machinist, or the farmer, or the school teacher. They feel society has settled back into a comfortable hypocrisy in which the crime is to get caught.
We're at a stage now where our Prime Minister will be a marijuana criminal, whether we like it or not. The fact that Kim Campbell or Jean Charest were not caught when they partook of marijuana doesn't make them any less of a cannabis criminal.
They're no different than I am, except they're in a higher up position and can get away with it better off than the small guy.
It's kind of hypocritical, eh? Throwing me in jail for something politicians are doing or admitting to doing, you know.
A few other notes. Most Canadian pot smokers now buy Canadian. Hydroponic grow labs in British Columbia and Ontario now produce the most potent pot on earth. Conviction rates are no longer kept, but simple possession is by far the most commonly laid drug charge in Canada. Nearly 17,000 people charged in 1991.
I think those who are powerful are now content with a situation where they themselves are protected. Their generation is not being prosecuted. And they don't worry about the others. There's a certain selfishness, a greediness, the stark 80s self-interest, which has marked that group which now has power.
Efforts are underway to rebuild normal Canada, but earlier this year, its new president was busted, and police seized the list of its new members.
Heavy medicine, you see my eyes are feeling red again. I'm bringing light like Thomas Funky Anderson. Been in the desert for 47 days, purple haze, the poison that it tasted.